Evening, everyone. My name is Brent Calvert. I'm president of the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators of British Columbia, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's webinar. The Federation of Post-Secondary Educators is a federation comprised of 20 independent post-secondary education locals right across British Columbia. The offices of FPSE, as we refer to the Federation, are located on the ancestral and unceded territorial lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And tonight I'm joining you from the ancestral lands of the Tsawwassen peoples. I'm particularly excited tonight to have reached out to members of the BC post-secondary sector right across British Columbia to join us for this important discussion around climate and taking climate action. I'd like to give a warm welcome to members of the Confederation of Faculty Associations of British Columbia, the BCIT Faculty and Staff Association, BC Government Employees Union Component 7, Move Up, and the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Together with the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators and private institutions across British Columbia, we make up the entire post-secondary sector tonight. So whether you're joining from those groups or received an invitation through one of those people, we welcome all attendees to the event tonight. So while we're in the middle of COVID-19, which has supplanted the interest and momentum and sense of urgency that was building in the climate movement, both crises share commonalities and their effects are converging, as both are born out of human activity leading to environmental degradation. Beginning to align our responses through mobilization presents an opportunity to improve public health, create a sustainable economic future, and better protect the planet's remaining natural resources and biodiversity. It's my pleasure now to introduce Kim Trainer, who is from Douglas College, one of our FPSE locals. And Kim is a member of our ad hoc committee on climate, and calling upon Kim to introduce our guest speaker tonight. Over to you, Kim.
Great, thank you, Brent. I am joining you also today from the traditional unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it is my pleasure to have been asked by the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators and the Ad Hoc Climate Committee to introduce you to Seth Klein, whose book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, appeared in September 2020. Seth is currently the team lead and director of strategy for the Climate Emergency Unit, a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute. For 22 years, he served as the founding BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, a public policy research institute committed to social, economic, and environmental justice. He has been a social activist for over 35 years. You can read more of Seth's bio on his website, and if you're a member of FPSE, in the AGM handbook. So what I'd like to concentrate on here is why A Good War is such an important book. First, it acknowledges that we're facing an existential threat, an emergency analogous to the Second World War, a threat that puts all species and communities at risk, especially those marginalized human communities who are already most vulnerable and already find themselves on the front lines, such as Indigenous communities in the north, where the Arctic is warming at a rate of twice the global average, and communities in the global south, where the seas are rising. Second, Seth's book offers a blueprint for survival, using lessons previously learned and successfully undertaken in the past, lessons related to youth leadership, to Indigenous leadership and knowledge, to grassroots organization, to the role of artists, the role of labor and unions, and significantly for all of us here tonight, to the role of educators in training and inspiring and in learning from the next generation, our students who will bear the brunt of the climate emergency that is upon us. Please join me now in welcoming Seth Klein.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Brent, and thank you, Kim, for that lovely introduction. I'm really thrilled that so many of you have joined us tonight, Zoom fatigue notwithstanding. Thank you all for your interest, and thank you to FPSE for this invitation. I know I've given addresses at a few of your institutions and locals in recent months, virtually of course, but I'm really very honored to be joining your full FPSE AGM at this opportune moment as you transition and reimagine your union at this critical historic juncture. And very glad that you've chosen to highlight the climate emergency in your gathering and deliberations. Like Kim, I am joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I'm going to be drawing upon my book, and I'm going to give about a 30-minute talk about how to mobilize Canada for the climate emergency, and then I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion and Q&A. This is my book, by the way, my first book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. My book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach to the crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And it endeavors to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis that we face. But in the feedback that I've had since the book came out last September, people are saying that they find it an unusually hopeful book, notwithstanding how dire the subject matter is. And as Kim said, the original twist of the book is that it is structured entirely around lessons from the Second World War. Prior to joining the CCPA over 2 decades ago, I was briefly a socialist teacher, like some of you. And one of the nice spin-off benefits of my book, I hope anyway, is its potential to make the study of World War II newly relevant to young people today, linking as it does our wartime experience to today's most pressing existential challenge. And building on what Kim said, make no mistake, that is what the climate crisis represents. If we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the rest of this century, things start to get very grim, marked by massive disruptions to food systems, mass loss of ecosystems and species, mass human migration, escalating extreme weather events, a world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, and quite possibly ungovernable. It is an ecological crisis, but it is just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. Put another way, over the lifespan of your current and future students, the climate emergency will be the defining issue of their lives. And so to all of you who have chosen a career dedicated to young people, this is also now your associated calling. Now, let me state at the outset that there's no small irony in me coming to this framework that I'm invoking. And like many of you, I'm sure I wrestle with this war analogy. My own political activism started as a teenager in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. Moreover, I'm the child of Vietnam War resistors. That is, in fact, how I happen to be Canadian. But I am now strongly of the view that climate breakdown requires a new mindset to mobilize all of society, to galvanize our politics, and to fundamentally remake our economy. And here's why I believe we need a new approach. I'm going to screen share for a moment and share a slide with you. I'm hoping that you all now see a slide of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years. If I showed you the same slide for British Columbia, it basically looks the same. We need a new approach because what we've been doing in response to the climate crisis so far simply isn't working. To put this in the parlance that we've all come to know in this pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. Despite decades of calls to action, our emissions are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our children and future generations. We have run out the clock with distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, actual GHG emissions, we have accomplished precious little. And so here we all are, confronting this harrowing gap between what the science says we must do and what our politics seems willing and prepared to entertain. Now, I didn't start off planning to write a war story. The book project began as an exploration of how to tackle that gap between and to try to align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently have to do. And the book is that. But initially in my book outline, I had planned to only have one chapter on lessons from the Second World War because I'd long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved into that work, I began to see more and more parallels between our wartime experience and the current crisis, and ultimately decided to restructure the entire book around those lessons. Because I saw in that history this helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we completely retooled the entire economy twice, in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so the book explores what wartime scale climate mobilization could actually mean. Each chapter is sort of half history, half present, as it explores those comparisons. And for me, the more I dug into that too, the more, even though I've dealt with this climate file, if you will, for well over a dozen years, it jolted my thinking to look through it fresh through the lens of emergency. And in those comparisons that I make, I want to start with one important comparison I make near the beginning because it gives me some hope, and it's this. Despite Canada's war declaration in September of 1939, it's worth recalling that even as the winds of war gathered in the late 1930s, our leaders, and in fact much of the public, was reluctant to recognize what would ultimately be necessary, a lot like today. You know, when you reflect on our pandemic experience, this World War II experience, our climate experience, all emergencies begin with a period of denial. Canada was on the cusp of being completely transformed by its Second World War experience, yet right up to the 11th hour, our government and most of the public still hoped to avoid getting dragged into that fight. And so we find ourselves in this similar awkward period today, where, the summer before last, the federal government passes a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day, and then proceeds with reapproving the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion the very next day. That's a dynamic that I call the new climate denialism. It's a concept I unpack in the book. But as with the Second World War, I'm convinced that this phony war period won't last. Indeed, that it's about to end. But one of the core lessons of the book is that emergencies, once recognized, transform us. They transform society, they transform social relations, they transform our economy, they transform our leaders. And I found myself fascinated by the alchemy of these moments, that combination of events and leadership that shifts the popular zeitgeist and brings us into emergency mode. And often we're surprised by those who are in leadership. If you had asked Canadians, I think, in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform the economy and society? I'm sure most Canadians would have said no, and they had no reason to believe otherwise. And if you had asked me 15 months ago whether or not there were people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada who could quickly pivot and create these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy, I would have said, no, there's no one home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. After 40 years of a neoliberal agenda that has as its most insidious legacy the sapping of our sense of possibility and our collective faith and our capacity to undertake great tasks together, I think the pandemic emergency has shown us how quickly we can change our ways and how swiftly we can throw out the rule book. So in some important ways, we emerge from this year we've had with our sense of imagination a bit restored. Ever since I released my book last September, I've done a lot of talks like this, I've done a lot of interviews, and in every one of them, I get asked, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And in trying to answer that question succinctly, I was forced to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers for when you know that a government has actually shifted into emergency mode. And I'm going to call up a slide just to show them to you, hoping that you see it now. So here's what they are. it spends what it takes to win. Number two, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. Number three, it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. And number four, it tells the truth. It tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. And it's striking to me that in the Second World War, the Canadian government did all four of those things. And likewise, in response to the pandemic, I would say the Trudeau government actually passes all four of those markers. We can quibble about the timing of some of them, but they hit all four markers. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe hits any of the four markers. It's not just that they miss some, they don't hit any of them. So I want to explore each of these indicators with you, and along with two other key lessons that I draw from our wartime experience. In the book, I group many more lessons into what I call the battle plan for climate mobilization. It's a 14-point plan of outlining what it looks like to adopt an emergency mindset and do what it takes to win. I'm not going to go through all 14 points tonight. That would take too long, but I do want to highlight a few. So marker number one, spend what it takes to win. A benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments out of this austerity mindset. So this year, in response to the COVID emergency, Canada's debt to GDP ratio has risen from about 30% of GDP to 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year. But consider that at the end of the Second World War, it was more than double that. It was well over 100%. And when C.D. Howe, who was the minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw Canada's wartime military production, was pressed about this unprecedented level of government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance that wartime effort, the government issued new public victory bonds, brought in new forms of progressive taxation, including, by the way, a cap on profits. So the kind of profiteering that we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. And I think as we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to employ similar tools. But federal spending and provincial spending on climate action pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic response. Let me give you one illustration. During this last year of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada, our federal crown corporation, has been buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. In contrast, the Trudeau government is currently spending on climate about $5 billion a year. So the Trudeau and Horgan governments aren't merely spending a little less than they should in the face of the climate emergency, they are spending less, probably by a 10-fold order of magnitude. Marker number two, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During World War II, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is simply mind-blowing. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in our province, where we struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships, again, from a base of virtually nothing. Remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of this guy, C.D. Howe, established 28 new crown corporations in order to meet that wartime production effort. Howe is a fascinating figure to me, C.D. Howe. He was no lefty, right? He was on the right wing in the Mackenzie King government. He'd made a lot of money in the private sector before going into politics, but he was seized with the task and he was in a hurry. So anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he creates another crown corporation to do it. His department undertook detailed economic planning to ensure that wartime production was prioritized. He carefully coordinated all of the input supply chain. Similarly, in the pandemic, we've witnessed the federal government create these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy with a speed that few of us would have predicted. Now, what we didn't do in this pandemic early on was recreate a new crown corporation like we used to have to mass produce vaccines. And this is my point about why I fixate on the importance of public enterprise. Because if you're not creating new public enterprises or crown corporations, the best you can do is try to incentivize somebody else to do what needs doing. So because we didn't create a new crown to mass produce vaccines, we become entirely reliant on imports from others. Worse than that, shamefully, we use our economic muscle to outbid poorer countries. In the war, we were the arsenal for our allies, in contrast. In response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. So in contrast to C.D. Howe's wartime creations, the Trudeau government in its time in office has created two new crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is basically a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure, and the other, I hate to say it, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to our province. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then it would establish a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. And all institutions, including educational ones, should be seeking to figure out their role in that task. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Now, I showed you that chart earlier that shows our GHG emissions just flatlined over the last 20 years. Why is that? I think a major reason for that is that if you survey our federal and provincial climate actions to date, our policies, what they all have in common is that they're voluntary. We encourage change, we incentivize change, we offer rebates, we send price signals. What we have decidedly not done is require change. If we are going to meet the GHG targets set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that you will no longer be allowed to buy a new fossil fuel burning vehicle as of 2025. We would mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to tie into natural gas lines or use other fossil fuels for heating as of next year. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicle makers and gas stations. That's how we would make clear that this is serious. By the way, these markers and measures that I'm outlining for you, they're not what we have in our provincial Clean BC climate plan. Lesson number 4, marker number 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. Many people assume that at the outbreak of the Second World War, everyone understood the threat and was ready to rally. That's not true. It took leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. The leaders that we most remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. Their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history they wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector that was keen to rally the public. Similarly, I think we've all witnessed that, and our governments have modeled that this past year through the pandemic, right? Around what emergency communications should look like. The messages are ubiquitous. We receive daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media has taken seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. Government leaders and media listen to science and health experts. None of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. When our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. If our leaders believe we face a climate emergency, then they need to act and speak like it's a damn emergency. Name it, speak about it all the time. That's what you do in a crisis. Those are the 4 markers, but I want to offer 2 other lessons. Another lesson, and it's a thread through my book, is that mass mobilizations require social solidarity, and inequality is toxic to social solidarity. There are these climate policy purists out there who say, don't link the fight on climate to inequality or social justice. Don't weigh it down. It's complicated enough as it is. I think they're wrong. First of all, they're wrong for reasons Kim mentioned off the top, because these issues are interconnected in many ways. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are as a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But we also need to link these issues because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. During the First World War, inequality undermined social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment efforts. And the King government was very acutely aware of this. And so at the outset of the Second World War, they took bold steps to lessen inequality and limit excess profits. We saw new forms of progressive taxation, as I say, come in the war. The corporate tax rate in the war went from 18 to 40%. And then they brought in this excess profits tax so that if your profits hit the average of the years before the war, your top rate became 100%. The war also saw the introduction of Canada's first major income support programs. Unemployment insurance comes in the war. The family allowance comes in the war. This famous Marsh report, this commission that laid the groundwork for the whole post-war welfare system, is written during the war and is offered up to Canadians as a pledge that the country they will come back to will look different than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you got the mobilization. That's when you hit the recruitment numbers. The point in recalling all of this, as we face today's threat and the need for mobilization, is twofold. First, to appreciate that inequality is a barrier to mobilization, but second, to understand that effective mobilization isn't merely about building more planes or tanks or today wind turbines and solar panels. It requires policies that fulfill a promise that we will better look after one another, that we will offer good jobs and income supports to all, and that people will be treated with dignity and fairness. When you're asking people to share in a great undertaking, that's how you keep everyone on the bus. And that's the kind of measures we're going to need again today. And they find an historic echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal, right? The polling shows us that when you link bold climate action to tackling inequality, support for that bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. The final lesson I want to leave you with, leave no one behind. I want to zero in here on the issue of jobs. There's about 200,000 or 300,000 Canadians who are directly employed in the fossil fuel industry today. Now that's a lot of people. We need to make a concrete offer to those people, a jobs guarantee to those people. But just to put that figure in perspective, in the Second World War, from a population of about 11 million, over 1 million Canadians enlisted, over 1 million Canadians were directly involved in military production, far more than are employed in the fossil fuel industry today. All of them had to be recruited and trained up, and then after the war reintegrated into a peacetime economy. That too took careful planning, and it took audacious new programs, from income support to housing support and post-secondary training. World War II transformed the post-secondary and secondary sectors with respect to training for military manufacturing, assisting in reintegration. Consider this: in the war, every tech high school in the country was running 3 shifts, including an overnight shift, training people up in the production that was required. And the size of our post-secondary sector basically doubled after the war as part of reintegrating people. And when you were on campus during World War II, by God, you knew that you were at school at a time of emergency. Everything about the experience reinforced that point. The whole machinery of these educational institutions pivoted to the imperative of the emergency. The ambition of these programs should be a model for what just transition should look like for workers today. Sorry, there's a phone going off in my background, but ignore it. These 4 markers that I've just walked you through, they don't apply just to governments. I'm gonna call them up again. There, I think you see them. Those 4 markers can and should apply to any large institution, including post-secondary institutions and to unions like FPSE. As you consider this moment of transformation for your union, I invite you to dig into these 4 markers and use them as a guide. Whether it's your union or your college or university or institute, the path to victory in the climate mobilization means climate isn't siloed off in some program area or committee. It's embedded into the institutional DNA. So what would that look like in practice? Let me walk you through those 4 markers again. Spend what it takes to win. Is an appropriate share of your institution's budget being allocated to the emergency, particularly the capital budget for buildings and their fuel swapping, charging infrastructure, converting the vehicle fleets to electric, transit access? Meaning, does the spending align with the reality of the emergency, or is it incongruous? Marker 2, create new institutions and programs to get the job done. Are you creating special climate programs in your institutions as major areas of study? But again, not just siloed off, but embedded in every faculty and in the work of your union. Are you ramping up the training that will be needed to transition our economy in every domain? Are you recruiting students for that? Does it feel like your institution is all about the speed and scale of this moment? Are you changing systems and processes so that you don't need to travel by air, including, dare I say it, to union conferences once we get through this pandemic? And just to go even a little more controversial here and make a little mischief for your union exec here, if you don't mind, is the climate emergency showing up at your bargaining table? Why not bargain eco-transit benefits for those staff who don't use a car to commute? Or better yet, why not make the speedy transition of your institutions a bargaining issue? Bring a carbon zero transition plan to the table so that you're in the driver's seat, and invite your students to stand with you in that fight. And they may learn a lesson about the power that can come from workers and youth acting in solidarity together that they'll never forget. I have an idea in the book for a youth climate corps, and I've been thinking more and more about it, right? Young people, I'm gonna stop the screen share here. Young people in the Second World War, I said over 1 million of them, Canadians enlisted. 70% of them were under the age of 21. A whole lot of them, they deferred their studies and then they enlisted. It got me thinking, like, if I were, and I hope you good educators don't take this the wrong way. If I were a young person today, 18 years old, finishing high school, I'd be thinking pretty hard about whether or not I wanted to continue in my post-secondary studies, or whether or not I wanted to meet this moment. But maybe if we had a youth climate corps that combined letting young people study in post-secondary institutions while also rolling up their sleeves in the field to meet this moment, wouldn't that be appealing to a lot of young people? The third marker, moving from voluntary to mandatory measures. Are your institutions setting clear dates for all of your buildings to fuel swap? Are they ensuring that no new buildings are tying into gas? Are they creating new parking regulations that are going to change how people access your campuses? Are the cafeterias and food courts being mandated to change how they source their products, what they source and how local? Are you banning fossil fuel sponsored events and curricular materials from your institutions? Is your union and pension fund and post-secondary institution divesting from fossil fuels? The point is, you want to communicate to society and to your students that this is an emergency, that you're not compromised, and that those who would block progress on this task of our lives won't be appeased. Which brings me to marker 4, tell the truth and rally the public. Well, as educators, that's your business, ain't it? But are your students and Federation members hearing that truth from you in a manner that aligns with this historic moment? Are your students feeling supported when they strike for the climate? And is your union speaking up strongly to the provincial and federal government, demanding a real and convincing and compelling climate emergency plan? Because we don't have one now. This is what educational institutions and unions should be doing. And if your post-secondary institution isn't, then increasingly in the coming years, I predict, the most visionary and engaged young people of this generation are going to choose to go somewhere else. I want to offer just a final thought, and then we'll open this up to Q&A. Just as the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic and an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure, a Green New Deal can be just what the doctor ordered. The vital and urgent challenge now is to ensure that we use this experience and the opening it creates to catapult our societies into the post-carbon economy. I want to highlight one notable difference, though, between the pandemic and this climate crossroads moment. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that's real. Some have responded to my thesis by saying, look how quickly we've all tired of emergency and in this pandemic in less than a year. And now here I am asking that we all spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things we are called upon to do in response to the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home, and that's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. Like many of you, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world we're leaving our kids and those who will live out throughout most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle with despair. That's the ambiguous time in which we live. We don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to rise to the challenge in time. But consider this. I keep saying how in the Second World War, from a population of 11 million, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. That is remarkable, isn't it? 70% of them under the age of 21, like your students, for a lot of them. But it's worth appreciating what they didn't know. Those who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago didn't know if they would win. We often forget there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how their story ended. They didn't. And yet that generation rallied regardless. And in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving, not just on the battlefront, but on the home front, and the complete transformation of their society. That's the spirit we need today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seth. Amazing address. Every time I get to hear you speak, I go deeper and deeper into the topic, and it's so inspiring. We're so lucky to have you on the coast with us as part of the Vancouver community. The important thing tonight is we now want to get to some of your questions, and I see that people have been upvoting and pushing things through the top. I'm sure we'll get a run here as we go. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim with her selection as the first question.
Thanks, Brent, and thank you so much, Seth, for that talk. They're all great questions, and I think I'm just going to go in order because they're great. So I'm starting with Don Alexander, who is writing to us from Vancouver Island University, I believe. So he asks, some post-secondary institutions in BC have shown, no fingers pointed, have shown exemplary leadership in addressing the climate emergency. Others are lagging way behind, are not even acknowledging it. And I can certainly speak to that. What do you think would be effective ways to light a fire under these laggards?
Well, first of all, I would say, we're in that awkward moment I referred to before. So even those institutions, those post-secondary institutions that have declared climate emergency are still not in climate emergency. And that's where I invite you all to use these 4 markers. And I've shared the website for the climate emergency unit where I have the 4 markers listed, by the way, as a way of engaging your institutions to say, let's get real. We've passed a resolution, but now we have to make it real. A lot of municipalities are wrestling with the same thing. Dozens of them have declared climate emergency, but few of them have moved beyond the symbolic to the meaningful, to the concrete. So how do you do it? This is a political moment to bring about the collective action that we need, whether it's political action directed towards our federal and provincial governments or to all of the institutions in our lives. And I guess my main recommendation in answer to Don's question is to make common cause with your students. They're already there. And I think more and more, this is what I was hinting at when I said take it to the bargaining table. I'm convinced, here's what I know from the polling I commissioned for the book. Canadians by and large are already shifting into emergency mode, the younger you are, the more you're there. Your students are there. So invite them to make common cause with you. And powerful things can happen. I tell the story in the book about, well, my wife's experience in Vancouver. So my wife's a Vancouver City Councillor, Christine Boyle, who moved the climate emergency motion 2.5 years ago. And Vancouver now has an actual climate emergency plan, one of the most robust municipal plans in North America. When she first brought those motions forward, she was pretty sure she had the votes. She didn't know by how much. And they ended up passing unanimously. And for anyone who follows Vancouver politics, you will know that the city council, they're all over the political map. No party has a majority. Kim, you never know how this gang is going to vote. But they passed unanimously. How did that happen? Beyond the fact that my wife's really good at her job. What she would say is it happened because each time those votes happened, dozens, mostly high school students, but also post-secondary students, but mostly high school students skipped school, rallied outside, spoke before council, filled the galleries, and they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. They did that. You can do that in your campuses.
Yeah, my experience also has been with my students. They have a tremendous energy, and our committee, our ad hoc climate committee at Douglas, has a couple of student reps on our committee, and they're fantastic. So they're a wonderful, wonderful group of people to work with. My next question is from Chris Ailes, who's coming to us from Camosun. And you may have already begun to answer this with relation to bargaining, but he says, if you could identify one best way for post-secondary unions to make a difference in the climate crisis, and students obviously, what would it be?
Well, I feel like I gave you a good long list there.
I know, right?
A real laundry list.
Give us more.
But I think the point, if I had to kind of summarize it, the point is to put them together in a package that is a carbon zero transition plan for your institution. Like, I think this is the question for any union. Do you want to be kind of banging on the door saying, we want a seat at the table while you discuss your climate plan? Or do you want to just seize control of this thing and you preemptively be the ones who design a zero carbon plan, for your institution, for your campus, and you bring it to the table and make the administration respond to you, and make common cause, as we've been saying with your students. That's when I think things can get interesting.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, and I have a question from Jeff Lewis. And he is asking, while war and COVID are seen as immediate threats by most people, how do we best convey the emergency of the climate crisis when many do not yet see how it impacts their own lives?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, I want to reiterate this point I said in passing in my speech. Every emergency begins with a period of denial. In the rearview mirror, we assume that Canadians in 1939 understood the threat to be clear and present. They didn't. Let me disabuse you of that. It was not a clear and present threat. It was on the other side of two oceans. If you were in Europe, it was a clear and present threat. But if you were in Canada, it was not. And as I said, people were very reluctant to actually shift to that mode. And all of these events, wrestle with what's the combination of events and leadership that shifts the zeitgeist. Let's think about it with COVID. Now, think about all of us 16 months ago, starting to hear stories of this new virus in parts of the world, but we were all in denial. None of us knew how this thing was going to upend our lives as it has this past year. And we can all remember certain events, right? I remember when they canceled the NBA season, Kim. Now, I don't even watch basketball, but I remember when that came across the news and I was like, whoa, that's different. They canceled the whole thing. I also know that it took seeing my prime minister in front of his house every morning with a briefing. That communicated emergency to me. So these are the things we need to replicate again. Now, in the case of climate, The curse of climate compared to both, in fairness to the question, is that it moves in slower motion, and that does present a challenge. However, extreme weather events have shifted that zeitgeist. So in the polling I commissioned for my book from Abacus Data, I asked questions about emergency. I asked whether or not people had experienced, or they or someone close to them, an extreme weather event connected to climate. And a majority of Canadians said yes. That I wouldn't have gotten the same results 2 years earlier. Meaning the terrain has shifted, where people have gone from seeing it as a threat somewhere else, sometime in the future, to here and now. That shift in the political terrain was already happening before COVID. What's been missing is the political leadership. There is nothing about our provincial climate plan or our federal climate plan that feels like a grand societal undertaking. And until it does, we're not going to be there.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. I have a question here from Colin Gilker, and he's asking, and this is related to the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. And he says, given that there are colonial structures in Canada and that the roots of the climate crisis have deep roots in these structures and extractivist resource production as well, what role do you think truth and reconciliation can play in creating a paradigm shift in the way we internalize our relationships to the natural world and to one another?
Well, beyond even truth and reconciliation, I think decolonization and in particular, the recognition and assertion. So I have a chapter in the book on Indigenous leadership in the climate emergency. And one of my lessons, which I didn't include tonight in that climate mobilization, is that the recognition and assertion of Indigenous rights and title is actually central to winning. We have seen this, we've all been witness to this over and over again in recent years, that time and time and time again, Indigenous-led efforts to and the assertion of rights and title has been slowing and blocking new fossil fuel infrastructure projects until such time as our mainstream politics comes into alignment with what the science says we have to do. It's been buying us time. And on the flip side, a lot of the about 20% of the renewable energy projects in the country are Indigenous-led. So in both the blocking and the new, we're seeing tremendous Indigenous leadership. We still have to be wary. I mean, I'm not going to have time to go into it, but I spend time in the book wrestling with these paradoxes that, for example, many of the very wartime crown corporations that I laud in the book also poisoned Indigenous lands and people. And my point in recalling these cautionary tales is that as we mobilize in the face of another emergency, we have to do so eyes wide open and committed not to repeat the sins of the past.
I think one thing we're finding certainly at FPSE is there's such an interconnection of all of these concerns. So human rights and Indigenous rights and sovereignty and extractivist resources and climate justice, right? Like you can't address one without addressing all of them simultaneously.
Indeed.
Let's see. Oh, so many questions.
By the way, I'm gonna share in the chat a link to the book just in case anyone wants.
Okay, super. Let's see. Okay, so this question comes from Greg Harris, and maybe I'll give it to you the way he asks it, and then I might rephrase it myself. But he says, we know what needs to happen to mitigate catastrophic global climate change, and we have the technology to achieve it, but experience tells us government leaders don't respond to emergencies until the last moment. What has to happen to force leaders to act now? And maybe I would follow that up with a corollary. If you were Justin Trudeau, what would you be doing right this moment? What would be your plan? The first 2 or 3 steps you would take? Because I fantasize about that myself.
Oh, me too.
Right?
Trust me. That's a good question. Well, we are in the last moment. I mean, part of what it's a hard one to answer. I mean, part of what I say in the book is that what's held us back is that 40-year legacy of neoliberalism. And that has impacted every political party's leadership of every political stripe, right? Why aren't governments following the 4 markers? Why aren't they spending what it takes to win? Why aren't they creating new public institutions to get the job done? Why aren't they just using the regulatory power of the state to require change? Because they all falsely accept these assumptions about what is and isn't allowed. And the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism is the sapping of our, as I said, our belief in our capacity to do great things together. I do hope that the COVID experience has shaken that all up a little bit. What I am trying to, so now that the book is out and I have this climate emergency unit, I am engaging with political leaders. I actually am meeting with Minister Wilkinson tomorrow. What I'm trying to say to them is, the strategy isn't going to work. The current strategy isn't going to work because we are trying to incentivize our way to victory, and we won't. We have to seize hold of those 4 markers. The fun thing, though, about this last 9 months being out there with the book, it has been amazing to me to discover, touring with the book, how deeply resonant this 80-year-old story remains for so many Canadians, particularly a lot of political leaders. Like a whole bunch of them are World War II buffs. It's kind of funny. And so I use that to make mischief with them, to say, you know, all of these political considerations you wrestle with, but these people you admire, who are important to your sense of purpose and legacy, this is what they did. And now here we are again. And who do you want to be? And it's fun.
I'm not sure if you answered my question, though, what you would do if you were Justin Trudeau.
Well, so I would follow the 4 markers.
I would shut down the pipeline, first of all.
Oh, yeah.
Although the hummingbirds have done a pretty good job to help us with that one.
Well, so the first order of business, and mercifully reinforced today for anyone who missed it, by the International Energy Agency. The International Agency has been, for decades, has been a friend of the fossil fuel industry. Today, they said there is no longer a justification for any new fossil fuel infrastructure or development. I mean, this is earth-shattering. The Trudeau government and the Horgan government have been justifying their fossil fuel projects, whether it's Trans Mountain Pipeline or LNG, based on reports from the International Agency that have purported to say that the demand will still be there. Except today, the IEA said, no, it won't. We definitely, point 1, as you say, Kim, is no new infrastructure. But beyond that, I would follow the 4 markers. I would say we need to spend the appropriate amount. I would create a youth climate corps, especially now when young people are struggling with the loss of jobs in the pandemic, and make it huge, make it audacious. You know, give young people this opportunity to make the contribution that thousands of them want to make. I would create, and in particular, we need to make a concrete offer to Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. I would create an audacious new federal transfer program. I would call it a climate emergency just transition program. I would make it 20 to $40 billion a year, and I would link the amounts going to each province to their GHG emissions. So Alberta, which is the source of most of more than any other province, 38% of our emissions, would get 38% of the money. Well, with the catch, we wouldn't send it to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted on this. We would create new just transition agencies in every province, jointly governed by all levels of government and Indigenous nations and workers and business. But we would have comfort that the money was being used on climate infrastructure and training, but with billions of dollars on the table so that people could see that just transition wasn't just a hollow promise like in the past, that it was real and concrete and big.
Yeah, I love that idea of having a youth, some kind of youth group, youth climate brigade or something. I've been talking to students at Douglas, and I had a student doing research actually for me on climate change, and she was saying she just wants more programs that students can engage with and become part of. Like UBC apparently has student climate ambassadors, which I think is a great idea. So they get some work experience and they get to actually communicate with each other and get out there and do stuff and feel like there's purpose. Maybe this connects back to another question here. It's sort of, there's two that are a little bit similar, but one is
By the way,
asking,
Kim, there's a ton of great pilots like that. The point of this moment is about speed and scale. They're all off on scale.
Yeah. So you're talking about like at the federal level, sort of across the country.
Or provincially, the province could do it too.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
But take these innovative, neat programs and magnify them many times.
Yeah, certainly thinking of COVID, I mean, there are so many students and youth who are out of work or who are really waiting for something that they can work on and feel a sense of purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting close to the 8 o'clock mark, and I'm not sure, Brent, if what your thinking is. I have still a fair number of questions I could throw out there, or we could end it on the uplifting note.
I think we can probably fit in one more short question and then I'll wrap it up. So go ahead, Kim.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm gonna go to I think Arthur's question we've already addressed in a way, like how might we inspire our students and mobilize them. But I'll come back to this last one, urgency versus despair. And I know this is a common concern that many activists and people who are really concerned about the emergency are dealing with. Where's the line when it comes to engaging voters en masse?
I was trying to get, it's a very important question. I was trying to get at it when I was sharing at the end of my talk, that point about the ambiguous time in which we live. I think we have to be forthright with people that, and not Pollyanna with people, because it's not credible to be Pollyanna. We just don't know. And, often I feel like, professional communicators make this false dichotomy between, are we motivated by fear or by hope? We're both, by fear, hope, and love. And that was true equally in World War II, as it is today. And so we just need to be forthright with people in our lives and our students that we don't know, and we have to do it anyway. And I guess what I'm trying to do in the book is simply to invite people to have these conversations with the people in our lives and our own leaders in different institutions about this moment. And moments, we've all lived through it this year, where we surprised ourselves, right? At different levels. We're all a bundle of contradictions of virtues and vices and good and bad. And in moments of challenge and crisis, we get to decide who do we want to be. And maybe I'll close with this, if I may, Kim, and it's sort of where I've closed the book too. You've heard me giving, I'm like everyone's weird uncle going back to the war this, the war that. None of us on this call, I suspect, were alive in World War II. But lots of people have an appreciation for this history, as I say. And if our Netflix streams and our bookstore shelves are any indication, a ton of people are fascinated by it. And I think when they turn off these shows at night or put the book down, there's a question in their head. And it's this: what would I have done if I had lived then and there? And I think a lot of your students are probably asking the same question at this time. What would I have done if I had lived then and there? But the answer today is really no mystery, because the future of young people and our kids is again thrown into doubt. There's another civilizational threat at our doorstep. So the answer to that question is whatever we're each ready to do now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both to you, Kim, for the introduction of Seth and for running the QA period. Very much appreciated. And Seth, I can't say enough again. It's such a pleasure every opportunity we get to hear you speak. I did want to let you know that as we return to campus, one thing we will be doing is doing our best to get your book into those campus libraries and access for people on campus to use. And you can look for us becoming involved with the Climate Emergency Unit as well. Two really great initiatives that are enduring and opening, and certainly you've got our support on both of those with FPSE. And what I wanted to just mention here is that the hunger for what you're bringing is only growing. I saw a question in the chat I really loved. I want you to think about this for the next time we get a chance to talk to you, but it was basically, who was the Seth Klein of 1939? I think it has a good ring to it. And you know, maybe next time we meet, we can do that. I did want to close my comments on your comment towards the end about scale and bring it back to this event tonight. It would have been, you know, easy to have this event just with FPSE and the AGM, but we went out of our way to expand what we call our scale to the BC post-secondary education sector. And by reaching out to the other unions and groups that are involved and interested in post-secondary education, it is our hope that we will start to mobilize at the right scale to make a difference on this matter and several other matters in our province. And with that work, I think we're at the start of something really, really special. And what I wanted to give people a heads up is this was our first event tonight, and you can look for more events like this coming from us in support of the post-secondary education sector. And thanks to you, Seth. This will be a memorable moment for us as we kick this off and see what we can do to get behind this initiative in a more fulsome way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.